Hello everyone, welcome our on-site and online audience for joining the International Academic Lecture Series of the Pride of Hong Kong, 3 Preeminent Collections of Ancient Paintings and Calligraphies exhibition. This lecture series is made possible by the generous support of the北山堂Foundation. Today's second lecture will be presented by Professor Elizabeth Kindall. Professor Kindall is the professor of art history at the University of St. Thomas in the U.S. She specializes in site-specific Chinese landscape painting. Her research, Geolative of a Filial Son, the paintings of Huang Xiangjian, examines place paintings of Suzhou and southwest China. The topic of this lecture is Freshly Painted in a Spirit of Fear, Huang Xiangjian's Sublime paintings of southwest China. At the end of the lecture, there will be a 20-minute Q&A session. We encourage both the on-site and online audience to ask questions for Professor Kindall. So let's welcome Professor Elizabeth Kindall. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming up. So I'm really very happy to join you today to celebrate really the stunning exhibition of the collections of ancient paintings and calligraphies of the Shubajai, Zhilolo, and Beishantong collections. And I'd very much like to thank the Hong Kong Museum of Art for inviting me to speak to you today. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Sherry Feng and Yiting An for showing me around yesterday, and we had such a lovely time in the Huang Xiangjian gallery devoted to him. It was my dream. It was wonderful, just so wonderful to be there. It was so great. Celine Tam did a lot. She couldn't join us today, but I wanted to thank her anyway. And then a very special thanks to Nadia Lau for inviting me and for showing me around and for helping me through all of this. There you are. So thank you so much. So how is the sound? Is it all right? I feel like I'm ringing a little bit. Is it okay? Good. All right. Excellent. So in today's talk, I would like to introduce you to the work of a Ming Dynasty artist found in all 3 collections. This is Huang Xiangjian. We're looking at a later imaginary portrait of him. Today, I would like to introduce you to Huang Xiangjian and his story, using his paintings and his writings. I will then suggest why he created so many paintings of his life story through an examination of his work. Please note that Huang includes himself and sometimes his parents in all of his paintings. So one of the pleasures of examining his work is finding the Huang family embedded in the images. So do you see him in this painting from the Zhilolo collection? All right, I'm seeing fingers. Well done. Well done, everyone. All right, keep up the good work. So Huang Xiangjian lived in the late Ming Dynasty. He was the son of Huang Kongjiao, an educated gentleman of Suzhou. Suzhou, as many of you know, was one of the most prosperous and culturally preeminent cities of late Ming China. This is a painting by the Ming artist Chen Si of one of its famous gates, Chong Gate, where much commerce occurred and where people departed to travel to other areas of China. Late Ming Suzhou was an exciting place for the educated son of a sub-elite gentleman like Huang Kongjiao. People met and mingled in literary societies, charitable organizations, Buddhist study groups, personal libraries, government-sponsored schools, shopping districts, festivals, and private and public art viewings. Now, by public art viewings, I mean that collectors displayed their art for groups of acquaintances. Also of note at this time is that as people like Huang Kongjiao navigated overlapping cultural networks, they interacted with urban and suburban educated elite who moved between traditional categories of official, gentry, student, and merchant. So people played a variety of roles in society at this time. So what was Huang's role in all of this? He likely lived a fairly traditional young life. Much of the activities of his 20s and 30s revolved around preparations to pass the official examinations to serve as a government official. He was one of approximately 50,000 candidates throughout China, competing for only 1,300 provincial-level Juran degrees available at this time. When not studying, he likely met friends for various social events and created paintings to commemorate these social occasions, much like this fan that we see here that was done by Huang Xiangjian. He used paintings like this to express his chosen role as a cultured, educated man of Suzhou and to cement important relationships for him within specific cultural spheres. So he would get together with a friend, then he would make this painting as a memento of that get-together. In the end, if Huang Xiangjian did attempt the official examinations of the late Ming Dynasty, like most young men of this period, he did not pass them. Then, in 1643, his entire life changed. In 1643, Huang's father was appointed district magistrate of Dayao in Yunnan, and Huang Kongjiao's wife and nephew accompanied him to his post. Here we see the trajectory of the route they traveled to arrive at this posting, and it was by no means as straight as I've made this picture, right? Then, the following year, the Ming Dynasty began to fall. By 1645, the city of Suzhou was controlled by the Manchu invaders. The flags on this map illustrate the many Ming descendants who sought to establish satellite southern Ming courts to maintain the dynasty. All of these, as we know, eventually were defeated, and this conflict continued on into 1952. Now, by this time, Huang had not heard from his parents for at least 8 years. Unsure whether they were alive or dead, Huang set out to find them. He traveled 558 days over 2,800 miles. Here is the route Google Maps gives you if you want to walk from Suzhou to Dayao today. It looks rough. Very rough, and you can see the various areas you go to get to Dayao, finally. Not only was it over the full length of China, but Huang traveled through the frightening landscapes of the southwest, as we see here in this video, just of sights of Sichuan, and he, of course, did not have a minivan, so it was much more challenging. This is a tourist video, so it looks quite beautiful, but I still think it's quite harrowing to see the type of topography that he was moving through at this time. And we see that it's been made very beautiful. You can imagine walking through these landscapes and how frightening this would be to someone who was used to the flatlands of the south and Suzhou. Now, not only was the topography quite frightening and challenging for Huang, but Huang also braved other elements. Bandits, native peoples he was afraid of, man-eating tigers, disease-infested regions, and earthquakes. He actually traveled through an earthquake. And we see these mountains, of course, of Sichuan and Guizhou as well, that just go on into the distance forever, as those of you who have traveled there know. So Huang illustrated these terrifying elements of his journey in his paintings. The intimidating mountains that appear to extend without end into the distance, we see them. The frightening villages of native peoples built amongst them, and we can see some guards down there guarding the village. He had to move through soldier encampments and make his way, hopefully, around them in wartime. And you can see that this is quite an extensive encampment in the southwest at the time. These were likely southern Ming soldiers, because as you see, as we draw closer, they're riding elephants, which was an element of those particular troops, and there they are closer on their elephants, their war elephants. Now, this inscription that Huang wrote on one of his paintings, I feel really describes his extreme trepidation in dealing with these soldiers and elephants. After going through Qinguang, I passed through Baikou, where soldiers on elephants blocked the road. I was unable to get by them, and I had to wait for them to examine my papers before they would release me, so I stayed on here temporarily. Not only did that give me anxious thoughts, but I was extremely afraid because that day I had to walk a gantlet through these armed soldiers. So he's constantly dealing with soldiers that he doesn't really know which side they're on, and he has to show them his papers, and they think he's a spy, and it's super frightening for him, right? The extreme fogs and clouds of these regions indicated to traditional travelers like Huang that disease hung in the air. It was believed that this disease was contained in these mists that we see in one of Huang's paintings here. And yet he is traveling through it. In this image, he's traveling with his parents, and we see them down below. Not only was Huang traveling through these challenging elements of the Southwest, he was challenging through the Southwest during a climactic event, which is the Little Ice Age, in which there was more precipitation and temperatures were yet colder. Therefore, in some of Huang's paintings, we see these snowy landscapes, such as at the border of Guizhou and Yunnan, something that we really don't associate with those southwestern areas. And Huang describes this scene in the inscription he wrote for this painting. When we arrived at the arch that marks the scenic frontier of Yunnan, there was a heavy snow falling. This is where you enter Guizhou. Everywhere there are poisonous bamboo groves and precipitous peaks and cliffs, and even in the daytime you run into malarial mists on the roads. As the proverb says, the heavens never have 3 days of fair weather. The earth never has 3 li of level ground. So because of the rigors of the road, we did not dare sing as we walked. Despite almost impossible odds, Huang found his father and mother amidst the vast and mountainous province of Yunnan. He describes the moment he found them in the diary he kept of his journey. He wrote, "When I entered the gate, all was quiet. Our old maidservant was the only person in sight. What with my disheveled hair, for a minute she sat as we stared fixedly at each other until she recognized me. Then she cried out loudly in astonishment, 'Our young gentleman has come.' In disbelief, my mother said, 'It can't be.' By then, I had come up to the hall where I dropped my knapsack and shouted, 'Father, Mother.' Father was taking an afternoon nap and had not yet woken up. Startled, he jumped up hastily, asking who it was. Again and again, my mother shouted back, 'Our son has come.' Father, too, could not believe it. And as I rushed into his bedroom, he mumbled something from his dream and rubbed his eyes, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, our eyes met, and I threw myself onto the ground in front of his bed. We embraced and wept so uncontrollably that we could not stand. We finally got up by leaning against one another, sobbing the whole time. I can barely get through that without crying. It's such a touching moment for the family." Huang had achieved the impossible. He had found his parents. What was to be done next? After much discussion and planning, as well as a local fundraising trip, the family decided to attempt to journey home to Suzhou. Huang, of course, faced the same dangers on this trip home, with the additional challenge of caring for his elderly parents. We see the entire family returning home in this detail, and I've attempted to point out the family members for you. Father is in the sedan chair in front, and Huang Xiangjian is beside him. His mother is in the sedan chair behind them, and his cousin, his nephew, beside her. After many adventures, the family did manage to return home to Suzhou. Everyone survived, but this is what they returned home to. Nothing. They had nothing. Nothing. Huang Xiangjian describes this situation at the end of his diary, chronicling the journey home. He says, "We had prayed sincerely and been blessed by heaven, yet only the walls of our house were left standing, and not one grain remained in the storage jars. That my parents have no way to enjoy their old age causes me, their son, the greatest shame." How could the Huang family survive? In my research, I suggest that the family decided to construct particular social identities that would establish them as prominent individuals in Suzhou. It was a widely accepted practice to construct and publicize societal roles in the late Ming Dynasty, and this continued into the Qing Dynasty. Most educated citizens of late Ming Suzhou occupied multiple societal roles. However, many chose to construct and publicize one defining identity. Some educated individuals chose to use their calligraphy or painting skills to support themselves. This was such a well-known choice that the terms farming with the brush and inkstone rice field were common vocabulary. Gui Zhuang, a prominent calligrapher and friend of the Huang family, is one example. He actually explains this practice in an essay, and it begins this way. In my family, from the time of my ancestor, who sold his writings, to the time of my father, who sold his calligraphies and paintings, it has been several generations that we have farmed with our brushes in order to be self-supporting. Since the ruin of our family during the great turmoil and the passing of my father, I have fallen prey to hardship and starvation, and more than once was at death's door. In the last few years, as I have made a small name with my writing, as well as my calligraphy and painting, people have begun to come to buy them. My daily food depends on these demands for my literary and art works. I believe the Huang family chose to emphasize the heroic filiality of Huang Xiangjian as his primary persona. They sought to publicize Huang's extreme filiality with the ultimate goal of achieving for him the title filial son. To attain the title filial son, Huang could not be conventionally filial. Basic Confucian precepts, as we know, required every member of society to be filial. But only the most filial would be rewarded with an official title. Therefore, Huang had to be, as the family friend Li Kai-shu wrote, the filial son of filial sons. Gaining a reputation as a filial son would help the family survive. Filial sons were granted gifts of rice, money, government appointments, and a host of social benefits. I suggest that there were 3 parts to the filial son campaign: the diaries that record the Huang family odyssey, the colophons important friends wrote, stated that Huang's filiality was extraordinary, and finally, the paintings Huang created served as visual evidence of him as a filial son. The diaries Huang kept on the trip or wrote on his return were gathered together and published in 1655. Journey in Search of My Parents tells of his trip to find his parents, and Diary of the Return from Yunnan, as it says, describes the family's adventures on the journey home. Prominent friends of the family, such as Gui Zhuang, who we have met, wrote essays that were published with the diaries. Huang was also creating paintings of his trip at this time. Indeed, the majority of Huang's extant paintings date to between 1655 and 1659, and most of these may be dated to within the 5 years after his return to Suzhou. And as we see here from my research of his extant oeuvre, his paintings dated 1656, number 7. His one painting is dated 1657. We have 2 paintings that are dated 1658. And I suspect that 15 of his paintings that remain and that are undated were created in this time period as well, based on their style. Now, in this leaf from the Zhilolo collection, Huang is particularly difficult to find. So I think you might have considered him to be the person down there on horseback below, right? But he never reports riding on horseback. He took boats, and he climbed and walked on foot. So he's above. He's right there, walking on foot through the mountains. Interestingly, the attributes of the paintings and Huang's writings align with the structure of a classic filial piety tale. Now, traditionally, a classic filial piety tale introduced the character of the individual, narrated their filial acts, and presented the heroic nature of their filiality. So how do the writings and paintings reinforce Huang's filiality is the next question. Let's focus on Huang's inscriptions as evidence of this in his writings first. Huang's filial character is readily apparent in the inscriptions. As in a filial piety tale, the inscriptions highlight his filial character, emphasize his filial thoughts, and describe his filial actions. Some even include quotations from classic filial texts. For example, on this painting, and we see the inscription here illustrating Li Peak, This is what Huang wrote in translation. Li Peak Station. One climbs up the Guansuo mountain range on a long, narrow, and winding path, a twisting path amidst 1,000 peaks. Although the Guizhou region is the most precipitous area in which to dwell, there is a temple in the mountain range. The son of the marketing of Hanshou once held this place. To this day, the temple is impressive to look at. The tablet over the entrance has a 4-character inscription, "Great possessor of his father's spirit." When I passed by here, I was near the point of total exhaustion. So Guansuo mountain range that we see here was named for the marketing of Hanshou, who is actually the fictitious son of the celebrated military hero that I'm sure you are all familiar with, Guan Yu. Huang presents his journey as a classic filial piety tale in the paintings as well, by introducing his character, narrating his filial acts, and presenting his journey as a heroic odyssey. His character is illustrated by the juxtaposition of tiny figures, and these tiny figures contend with the natural, social, and political elements of his journey, as we've already seen. Here, in his description of this incident, we get a feel for this challenge. Qinglong Military Station Town, he writes, was on a dangerous peak above a river. The wild water of this river was even greater than at the Celestial Ditch, by which he means the Upper Yangtze. It was difficult to row the oars of the boat. Between the 2 cliffs there were attached splints, and a rope was strung through these and the mast. The boatmen relied on this throughout the crossing, but it was very dangerous. Now, in addition to character, the actions of a filial son are a primary element of a filial piety tale. Huang's paintings dramatically narrate his filial acts, as we've already seen. The true goal of these works, I want to emphasize, was to narrate his filiality and not to recreate an itinerary of his journey, which we really want to do when we look at them, right, is to map out his journey via the pictures. So, his albums do not illustrate this basic itinerary of sites from Suzhou to Dayao. Rather, Huang painted the types of filial acts he performed on his Odyssey. He identifies 10 basic filial acts in his works. He climbs these treacherous mountains. We see him climbing 2 of them here. He fords these rushing rivers and crosses frighteningly deep chasms. He treks through these dangerous flora and fauna. He suffers miserable weather, as we have seen. He confronts menacing animals. Elephants don't seem menacing to us, but war elephants, I imagine, were quite frightening, quite frightening. He also dealt with soldiers, and we don't see any soldiers at this iron bridge that he passes through, but he's constantly writing in his diaries of these dealings that he has with these frightening soldiers. And of course, native peoples, he found them very frightening as well. And here he is passing a village in one of these areas. And in these same areas, he's trying to seek shelter. This is another one of his challenges throughout his journey, trying to seek shelter. And then, of course, as with any explorer, he attempts not to lose his way, and he's constantly afraid that he's not going in the right direction. So, remember, Huang could not be conventionally filial. He had to be the filial son of filial sons. And so Huang presents his journey as this heroic odyssey of extreme obstacles. Hero tales of this type were popular in the 17th century, and the active hero was increasingly celebrated during the Ming transition in life and in literature. So Huang presents himself as heroically filial in his paintings by building up a landscape of extreme obstacles that he and his family have to overcome. He emphasizes the immediacy of their predicaments and the actions they took in response. nearly insurmountable natural elements, right? These massive mountain ranges, this rough terrain, flooding streams, malarial mist, drenching rains dominate each of these paintings. And amidst these natural elements and difficulties are dangerous human interactions, such as the soldiers mounted on elephants. Huang places the primary challenge of each episode prominently in the middle to lower foreground, so we see it right away. And Huang set extremely small figures of himself and his family within this overwhelming landscape. They're really tiny, right? And the landscape overshadows them. These tiny figures, I think, serve as foils to these dangerous obstacles in which they're enmeshed, and they enhance the staggering effect of the southwestern scenery. Regardless, the small figures of Huang and his family, they move ever forward through this all-encompassing terrain. And note that Huang always depicts them in action. And the majority of this movement is either physically or psychologically intense, even when we don't notice it at first. So for example, in this painting, here is Huang, and it doesn't, I mean, it looks like a scary terrain, but something even scarier is beyond. Up here, these are some animals with horns. He doesn't know what they are. When we get closer, they just look like bison or something like that to us. But this was very frightening to him, and the animals often, because they were wild, would surround him, and he found them quite frightening indeed. So these figures of Huang are always dealing with this, these psychologically intense landscapes that he's moving through. And he hikes through these stressful, mentally overwhelming situations on these often vertiginous mountain paths. And I would have to say this is one of my favorite paintings of Huang because it just captures that moment so well of how frightening and vertiginous he felt moving through the Southwest. And indeed, Huang heightened the action further by literally activating the landscape that we see. The landscape of each scene presents the immediacy of his predicament, and it surrounds and envelops him and his family in this pivotal moment of action, which he describes in his inscriptions as well. So again and again, there he is. Huang paints himself midway through a mountain range or in the center of a river. And the landscape compositions he created intensify the action of each scene. There's usually one strong diagonal that dominates each composition and moves the eye swiftly through the major elements of the scene. So we're looking at Qinglong Military Station, town, this leaf. The viewer first reads the inscription, and then your eyes move down the waterway past this outcropping of cliff to Huang's dangerous river crossing in the foreground, right? And the clarity and the strength, I think, of these diagonals are continuously pushing your eye down to the next active form within them. The animated sections of landscape that form these diagonals also, I think, appear to kind of move and shift before our eyes as viewers, actively twisting and curving, such as this looming precipice that we look at, it kind of seems to move. And this is a particular favorite of Huang's, these looming precipices over the scene. Now, the majority of Huang's paintings reinforce the filiality he exhibited on his journey in this way that I've been describing for you. Yet, he also created paintings that reinforced his filiality through their focal audience. And we see that focal audience in this image, his father. The Beichanton collection presents us with an excellent example of this type of painting. So we're going to look at a hand scroll from this collection that illustrates Mount Jizu in Yunnan, and I've given you an idea of where Jizu is, there in Yunnan. This mountain range is northeast of Dali, as you see there. And here's another view, a little closer view of where it is in relation to Dali. Now let's look at the actual hand scroll. Here it is. And at first glance, I would say this painting appears to be a typical landscape scroll consisting of unidentified landforms and caves and pavilions and overlooks. But I would suggest that a closer examination reveals it contains 31 constructed and natural landmarks identified in quite small characters and a lengthy inscription by the artist at the end. So let's move through the hand scroll first. The painting opens with a bustling fishing village at the edge of an expansive lake. A small spit of land and the route of a crowded sailboat convey viewers to the opposite shore. This is our lake, an impressively large lake that is about 40 kilometers north to south and covers 246 square kilometers. I highly recommend you visit. It's a beautiful lake, beautiful area. Now, on the opposite shore of this painted lake, we find a heavily cultivated, village-laden area of fantastic rock formations, roiling mountains, and cloudy waterways. The next section of the hand scroll offers a region boasting even higher, more jagged peaks and sheer rocky outcroppings. In this section, we see 3 figures, and they're preparing to cross a covered bridge that stands at the center of this section, as you see there. Now, as we unroll the scroll further, we find monasteries and pavilions nestled amidst alpine foliage that offer views of spectacular waterfalls and distant mountain summits emerging through clouds and mist. Finally, we arrive at a harrowing bridge and vertiginous stairs that lead viewers to the culminating point of the hand scroll, which is a pagoda at the peak of the mountain. Now, though the descent down the opposite side of this peak is faintly suggested, the underlying bank of snowy mountains moves the viewer's eye, I would suggest, from the pagoda directly across the composition to the lengthy closing inscription by Huang Xiangjian. And indeed, as you look at it, it seems really to underline it, doesn't it? These snow-covered mountains represent the Jade Dragonstone Mountains that rise some 5,596 meters above sea level. It is the southernmost section of the Himalayas. Now, the inscription at the end by Huang Xiangjian really describes the journey that we have just taken pictorially from the base of our lake to the summit of Mount Jitsu. He takes us through that story of the journey again. I believe Huang created this painting for his father because his father was the only person who could interpret every aspect of its content. Yet, this too would enhance the reputation of Huang Xiangjian and the Huang family in more private viewings of the painting. It particularly lauds the character, I would suggest, of Huang Hongjiao. Indeed, every element of this hand scroll bespeaks Huang Hongjiao. Only Huang Hongjiao had both the knowledge of the mountain and the personal experience climbing it necessary to understand and explain its full intent. Now, I suggest the entirety of the painting is structured to represent a daguan, or a grand view, of the Mount Jitsu region. Traditionally, a grand view represented a panoramic view from an elevated place that metaphorically implied the comprehensive understanding achieved by certain enlightened individuals. I would like to sketch out the major components Huang used to create this painting and how they worked together to create this special meaning related to his father. Now, I'm going to refer to this painting as Mount Jitsu because all of Huang's paintings are called Searching for My Parents, and it's super confusing. So we're going to call this Mount Jitsu, all right? My apologies to the collection, but that's what I'm going to do just for this talk. So Mount Jitsu, this painting, as a whole, presents the most symbolic and beautiful scenery within the area Huang Hongjiao had governed as district magistrate of Dayao. Furthermore, Huang Xiangjian provides a personalized route through 31 constructed and natural landmarks to the top of Mount Jitsu. These sites represent the tastes of his father, who was a Confucian gentleman interested in Buddhism. The 31 constructed and natural landmarks Huang identified in small characters that we see there designate a specific itinerary through the painted landscape. The labels and sites along this itinerary simulate the physical act of travel by encouraging the viewer to stop and appreciate each identified locality as though literally journeying through it. This same presentation of the journey experience is found in travel narratives and records of this time. So this is nothing unusual, and viewers would be familiar to this format. Huang included several very well-known spots on the mountain, such as Dragon Flower Monastery that we see here, and these were illustrated in printed books and admired by travel writers. A particularly favorite anecdote was the harrowing final climb up the steep and treacherous monkey stairs to the summit, where writers described that they could see the heels of the person in front of them as they were climbing because it was so steep. Huang also labeled sites rarely identified in other contemporary travel writings and gazetteers, such as Immortal Yang Cave that I've circled for you there. Huang included experiential renderings of sites with which Huang Kongjiao would have been personally familiar. Now, this technique organized the topography and the architectural elements of sites to recreate viewers' experience of them. These subtle topographical renderings of the mountain would have been understood by someone who had personally visited the mountain, such as Huang Kongjiao. He held the experiential knowledge necessary to visualize the unillustrated implications of certain sites. So, for example, in his rendering of Kashapa Monastery that we see here, Huang obscures the memorably steep steps visitors ascend to reach the temple behind a wall of rocks. These are not the original stairs, of course, that I'm showing you on the left, but I assume that the stairs were quite steep, somewhat similar to these at the time. Flower Domain is another example. Huang subtly suggests this site with daubs of red, and we just see these very slight daubs of red there. However, I think that Huang Kongjiao, his father, likely remembered this overwhelming experience of blooming azaleas, more like this, which is in modern Bijie City in Guizhou. You can imagine how amazing that would have been to see that. And here is, of course, I'm sure Guizhou City would love to have you visit that Bijie City in Guizhou. Huang personalizes the journey still further by joining his father in painted form on the climb. Two figures are the primary visitors to the mountain, and these two appear at 5 different locations on the mountain. We see them here preparing to cross Xishan Bridge. So Huang is represented in the light blue robes of someone who has not passed the official examinations, and his father wears the red robes of an official. And these two figures appear at 5 different locations on the mountain. They sit atop Pixiao Cliff, and they look off into the distance. They scurry beside the waterfall at Qishan Ravine. You see them there. They gaze into the Dragon Pool outside Haihui Monastery. And they also prepare to climb up to the summit pagoda along the monkey stairs. There they are again. As we know, Huang Xiangjian inevitably includes himself in his paintings. In the Mount Jizu painting, Huang places both himself and his father together, actively appreciating the natural surroundings. And they're within the painting, and they climb the mountain together. Huang composed the picture to recreate the experience of the climb as a whole as well. This too would have been evident only to someone who had ascended the mountain, such as his father. Now, climbing the 3,240-meter high mountain was a long and difficult endeavor. Even today, with the help of newly laid cement stairs. It takes several hours, even if you're in very good shape. I did a lot of resting, but it's quite a hike, quite a hike. Now, for those in the know, Huang cleverly exploited the hand scroll format to relate this arduous climb visually. Now, the first half of the scroll encompasses the 104 kilometers from the R Lake district to the base of Mount Jizhu. And that is when we arrive at the bridge, right? And this is represented by Cleanse the Heart Bridge, and that's about midway through the scroll. The second half of the hand scroll illustrates the vertical ascent of Mount Jizhu from this bridge. So the height of the mountain is only about 1/32 of the distance to the mountain from our lake, but the steep climb really makes the two distances feel comparable. So Huang divides his illustration of these two distances evenly over the scroll. He equates the easier, though lengthier trek to the base of Mount Jizhu, this section in blue, right, with the physical exertion and the time required to the summit, to climb to the summit, which we see here. His formula would have been understood only by an experienced Southwest traveler like Huang Xiangjian. He alone would realize Huang's depiction for what it was, an experiential illustration of the trip, the duration of the trip, the exertion of the trip. Now, one gains an extraordinary view from the summit of the mountain. And Huang Xiangjian describes this amazing outlook at the end of the inscription he wrote for the scroll. He states, "From the top of the pagoda was a dazzling view of the 1,000 peaks and myriad ravines. The billowing colors of green and blue were indescribable. Then, when I gazed westward, there were the mountains that looked like a jade dragon, stretching forward unbroken 1,000 li. It was marvelous and extraordinary." The summit of the mountain range at the end of their hand scroll is where Huang presents his father with a grand view. It was Huang Xiangjian's experience of the topography of Mount Jizhu that transformed the pictorial and literary descriptions of the journey through the landscape into an enlightened comprehension of the site and experience as a whole. It relied on his personal knowledge of the view from the highest vantage point atop the summit, as well as his ability to visualize the journey in its entirety. Now, from ancient times, writers utilized the term grand view as a condensed expression of all that a panoramic view of an elevated place implied. Evolving from its earliest appearance in the ancient Book of Changes, the I Ching, over time, the term grand view became a metaphor for the comprehensive understanding achieved by uniquely enlightened individuals. Now, Huang's grand view of Mount Jizhu that we see the summit of here relied on an experiential knowledge of the view from the summit that could not be attained from literary descriptions or printed renderings of the site or drones as we have today, right? Although reports of the view from the summit existed in the 17th century, they were vague and they were confused. And I'll let you finish this view. It's quite amazing, isn't it? All right, there it is. For example, the book Strange Views Within the Four Seas erroneously groups our lake, the Tiansong Mountains, and the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains together in the upper left corner of this illustration that we see here. Travel records and gazetteer descriptions of the mountain's topmost view are often equally confused, and their authors did not distinguish it from any other outlook. But only atop Mount Jizhu can you see both our lake and the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains. Our lake is to the southwest and the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains to the northwest. And I did not realize this until I had climbed them as well. I was actually there looking out in the different views. Only there also from the top can you imagine that you see our lake in its entirety. and you can see the Diansong Mountains in their entirety. You have a full view of them. So, when Huang Kongjiao examined this hand scroll, he would note that the impressive expanse of our lake to the southwest begins the hand scroll, right? Right here. While the jagged white terrain of the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains to the northwest of Mount Jizu concludes it, right here. When Huang Kongjiao reached the end of the hand scroll, he would recognize his son had illustrated a grand view of the region for him at the summit, right here. Huang Kongjiao knew the implication of his son's composition. Only from the summit of Mount Jizu could these two massive geographical formations be seen simultaneously. The view from the pagoda at the hand scroll's end implies that the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains that we see beside it, but also implies the view of our lake that begins the hand scroll, right? And by extension, everything that lies between them, the grand view, right? Now, at first glance, viewers might not comprehend the filial statement present in this painting. Yet, Huang Xiangjian created every element of this hand scroll, not only for his father's enjoyment, but also to illustrate his extreme admiration for his father. He chose to paint an area within Huang Kongjiao's administrative district. He illustrated a specific itinerary through the painted landscape representative of a personal trip taken by his father. He presented the individual sites on this journey as his father would have experienced them. He integrated both himself and his father into the painting, taking the journey together. He composed the picture to recreate the experience of the climb. And finally, he illustrated his father's comprehensive understanding by picturing a grand view of this mountain range. It is hard to imagine a more filial gift. Now, several bits of historical evidence suggest that the filial son campaign that I have suggested existed was successful. The family was celebrated in writing. Li Yu wrote the play Union Over 10,000 Li, and Liang Qingbiao composed a folk song poem lauding the Huang family. It would also appear that Huang Xiangjian was imperially recognized as a filial son in 1705 under the Kangxi Emperor. A colophon by the family friend Zhou Danling states that one of Huang's paintings was presented to the emperor as evidence of his filiality. There was even a pillar to filial son Huang erected in Liu Guozi Lane in Suzhou. This isn't it, but it gives you an idea of what it would have looked like at the time. Indeed, the Huang family story captured the hearts and the hopes of all those who learned of it. The family friend Tao Hongzuo captured people's admiration, I feel, best. Here is what he wrote. "We have had nobody like Huang and his father, where the father was a loyal official and the son a filial son, both in the same household. Huang's father commanded a far-off, remote district. When Yunnan was lost, he gave up his position and had to plow for himself, if only to preserve himself. Huang Xiangjian went 10,000 li on foot, through wilderness, wild beasts, and bristling lances, to serve his parents and bring them home. Would he have been able to do this without having loyalty and filiality rooted in his heart? I would hope that all who read this will become more caring towards their rulers and fathers, and not just let this admirable example go unimitated." The example of filial son Huang is preserved today, I would suggest, in large part thanks to the Beishantong, the Shubaijai, and the Zhilolo collections. Many thanks to them for doing so, and thank you also for joining us today to celebrate them. Thank you.